here so that I can, first of all, greetings to all of you, and I hope everyone can remain safe, and this is certainly a good way to do it. And I really thank Robert Hayes. I thank you very much for inviting me and for hosting this presentation. I think Tewksbury Public Library has been very helpful in that regard, and thanks very much for letting me do this. What I'm going to do now is share with you all a PowerPoint presentation that I have. So I'm going to, hopefully this is going to work. Okay, now let's go share. Okay, we're online here. Okay, so I start off by giving you a little bit of background about whether or not we can trust polls. We all know that in 2016, the polls, or at least the pundits, were predicting that Hillary Clinton would win by a very substantial likelihood. 538 Nate Silver suggested she had a 71% chance of winning. The New York Times said she had an 85% chance of winning. Huffington Post said 98% chance of winning. Not only that, they said she's going to win. Well, we know that didn't happen. So let's go back and take a look and see where the polls went wrong before we go forward and see if we can trust them in the future. So how wrong were the polls in 2016? This is a summary by Real Clear Politics, which is a website that you can go to, of the last polls. All these polls, these 11 polls right here, all had predictions. And as you can see, only the TIPB tracking poll showed that Trump might win. But when you take an average of all these polls, it showed that Clinton was ahead by an average of 45.5% to 42.2%, which is only a 3.3% difference. Given the fact, if you take a look down here at CBS News, you'll see that they predicted she had 45% of the support to 41%. And that margin of error right there, I pick on it because it's even, plus or minus 3. So that means that her actual numbers could have been as high as 48 or as low as 42, which means that Trump's could have been as high as 44 or as low as 39. So that gave, but when you take into account all of the, I mean, that's just based upon a sample size of 1,426. But if you base upon all of these respondents, 32,809 respondents, then the margin of error is only plus or minus 0.6. So that if you take the 45.5 and add plus 0.6, you get 46.1. And if you subtract 0.6 from Trump's, you get 41.6. So the best likelihood she had was of winning by either 4.5 percentage points or 2.1, based upon the margin of error. So in other words, take 3.3 up here and add or subtract plus 1.2 would give her 4.5, subtract 1.2 and you get 2.1. Well, we know that she won by 2.1. So what we can say is that the general election polls were basically within the margin of error. He's predicted that she would win by 3.3 percentage points. She won by 2.1. So it's right at the edge, but yes, she did win. Well, how wrong were the state polls? The state polls were really off. We know that she lost in the next 3 states that I'm going to cover, because had she won those, she would have won the electoral vote as well as the popular vote. But she lost in these 3 states. Now notice the polls here. There were only 4 polls that conducted surveys in it close to the election. And even then, the election was on November 8th. Notice that the latest poll only goes to November 2nd. And the other polls basically were a week out, right in here. So they all showed that she was going to win 8 points, 6 points, 6 points, 6 points. So her average winning streak, or her average of margin was 6.5%, but it had a margin of error of 2.8. That's twice the margin of error for each percentage. So her percentage was 4.65 plus or minus 1.4. Trump's, 46.8 plus or minus 1.4, since this is the average. And his was 40.3 plus or minus 1.4. So basically it's 6.5 plus or minus 2.8. So she should have won. Easily she should have won. But as we know, Trump won by 0.7. Same thing happened in Michigan. In Michigan, notice that, again, they had only 4, 5, 1, 2, 3, we only had 5 polls there in Michigan. She was up by 3.6 points with a margin of error of 2.8. So that meant a low of 0.8 and a high of 4.4. She should have been able to win according to the polls and based upon the margin of error, but she didn't. Trump did. And then in Pennsylvania. Now in Pennsylvania, she was only leading by 1.9 points, according to the summary. You can see the summary right here. Only one of them had, Trafalgar had Trump ahead, but they all had her ahead except for Harper, which had a tie. And if you just averaged all those, you'd come up with Clinton with a 1.1 margin, but a margin of error on the lead of 3.0, which means she could have won by as much as 4.9, or she could have lost by 1.1. Still, Nate Silver claimed that she had a 77% chance of winning in Pennsylvania. And to go back to Michigan, in Michigan, she had a 78.9% chance. And in Wisconsin, according to Nate Silver, 83.5%. Yet in each one of those cases, she lost. And there was something wrong with the state polls. You can give an example. New Hampshire did, in fact, go for Clinton by 0.3 and had an RCP average, Real Clear Politics average, of 0.3. So it's like, oh, the polls are accurate. Well, when you take a look at the actual results, you can see you had a really crazy results. And UNH WMER poll had her up by 11 right before the election. Emerson by only 1. But down here you had ARG, which is the American Research Group, saying that Trump was going to win by 5. In any case, when you averaged them all out, it came out to 0.3. But it does show you that there's a big variance in the polls. I did talk with the guy who does the UNH poll, who's Andy Smith, about why he was so far off. And he indicated he was off because, unlike previous years, this year there was a big correlation between education and who you're going to vote for. Typically, the Democratic Party has represented people of a lower socioeconomic scale because they're willing to have government help with assistance to the poor, with assistance to the middle class. But in 2016, things changed so that people without a college education, particularly men, particularly whites, were more likely to vote for Trump rather than vote for the Democratic Party. What that meant was that his sample, which tended to be underrepresent the socioeconomic group, did not adequately represent Trump voters. So when he went back and weighted his sample so that the sample was reflective of the people without a college education, he said then his numbers came in. But in any case, that was a problem in a lot of states. In North Carolina, the RCP average showed Trump with, just a little bit, but he won by a lot more. And it's hard to know what went wrong there. What you can see is that there was a big difference here. Trump leading by 7, by 5, Clinton leading by 3 and 1. So in North Carolina also, the state poll was pretty far off. There was a big report done by the American Association for Public Opinion Research about why there were these problems. And all they came up with was that every state had a different set of problems. In some states, the pollsters just simply were not that experienced. In other cases, they didn't weight the data as they should have to take into account the educational problem. And in some cases, as I showed you with respect to Wisconsin, the polls were done completed a full week before the election occurred. Well, I thought you might be interested to know what are those same polls show these days. Well, these days, it shows, this is a summary, as you can see, of the latest polls, because they go up, a lot of the most recent polls go up through through April 28th, which, just yesterday. So these are those 3 polls right here, Emerson, YouGov, and USA, and Emerson and YouGov were just reported on today. And they both continue to show Biden with a substantial lead of about 6 points. Most of the other polls also have Biden in the lead. Notice for later commentary that most of them are really registered voters. Harris has likely voters. I should tell you about Harris, they don't do telephone polls. They only do online polls, which is why there's no margin of error, because it's not a probabilistic poll, which I'll talk about a little bit later. But all of the other polls have been showing since the beginning of April that Biden has substantial lead, except for the Harris poll. Based upon a sample size of almost 11,000 respondents, the margin of error is only 1.0, which means the margin of error, that's a margin of error for 48.3 plus or minus 1, 42.0 plus or minus 1, which means it's Biden's lead plus or minus 2 points. So presumably, according to what the general election polls show, if the election were held today, Biden could win by as much as 8 points or lose or win by only 4 points. Well, what do the state polls show? Well, in Michigan, it's pretty strong, just as it was previously. It shows Biden leading by an average of 5.5 points. Now, notice that those polls, the latest polls, was done by Fox. And by the way, let me make a comment about Fox polls. We know that the Fox editorial programs have a particular orientation, to put it mildly. The Fox News poll is done by a Republican and a Democratic organization. So, and the Fox News polls tend to be right in the mainstream of good polls. It actually gets a pretty good rating by 538, Nate Silver, I think an A- or an A for their polling. So you can look at Fox News polls and be pretty clear and be pretty sure that they are as accurate as any poll might be. Anyway, the latest poll was only done, a week ago, and then the other 3 polls were all done in March. So That is the problem typically with state polls, is that there isn't a whole lot of polling going on. And a lot of times, the good pollsters will poll in the state during the campaign, but not right up to the end, so that we can't get an idea, so that their numbers can't be checked against the reality of an election. That point I'll talk about in a moment. Now, what about Wisconsin? In Wisconsin, it's a very close race. Even if, first of all, they're all in March, so we don't know what's happening in Wisconsin in May, at least according to what's on Real Clear Politics. I did go online to see if there weren't more polls. But based upon 3,740 respondents, the margin of error is 1.6 or 3.2 for the lead, which means that Biden could be ahead in Wisconsin based on March polls as much as 5.9 percentage points or behind by a half a percentage point. That would still mean that he has a greater than a 50% chance of winning if the election had been held in March, but not necessarily, but there is also a chance that he could have lost. Now, with respect to Pennsylvania also has been pretty consistent. We have the latest poll there is a week ago, done by Fox News, Susquehanna about a week ago, and then YouGov poll. But they're pretty consistent right there. And it shows that Biden had a lead of 6.7 average, and his margin would be plus or minus 4.0, which would mean if the election had been held during that period of time, if the polls were accurate and the margin of error was accurate, Biden would certainly have won in Pennsylvania, which he did not do 4 years ago. He lost by, I think, about 1 point or two, about just over a percentage point. In Florida, Biden didn't lose in 2016, of course, it was Hillary Clinton. So in Florida, the Biden is shown ahead by 3.2 points. Remember, in Florida 4 years ago, Hillary Clinton lost, again, by just over a percentage point. And the thinking going right now is, if the polls are correct, and we don't know that they are, and you've got some good pollsters here, Fox News and Quinnipiac. Again, their polls are a week old, but if they are correct, and they do in fact poll all the way through the campaign, what it's showing right now is that Biden is ahead on average in April by 3.2 percentage points, with a margin of error plus or minus 2. In other words, 5.2 or maybe 1.2 percentage point. And the thinking goes that if the Democrats do win in Florida, that will overcome any loss they might have in Wisconsin because of the great number of electoral votes that Florida has. So I'm just showing you where they are right now, but that doesn't necessarily mean that those numbers will persist. Now, with respect to the poll in Arizona, Hillary Clinton clearly lost in Arizona. And here we have Biden leading. Again, it's hard to say exactly what's going on because all of these polls were done in March. And the only one that was done in April, in early April, was done by a firm that nobody knows a whole heck of a lot about. They say it was likely voters and that Biden was up by 9. If that's true, given a 4% margin of error for the individual numbers, that would be plus or minus 8. That would be clearly Biden winning according to that one poll. Based upon all the polls of 5,000 respondents with a margin of error of 2.6, it also suggests that if those polls are reflective of what's going on in Arizona, this would really be a major upset, that a Democrat would win in Arizona. And finally, I'm looking at North Carolina to show you what's going on there. There are only 3 polls. This one is a Democratic pollster, public policy polling out of California. It shows, and this one, of course, was in early April. So based upon all those three polls, Trump has, because of the point +7, Trump has a margin of 0.3 plus or minus 4.2, which means, it could be anything. If we eliminate Civitas, we can only take the two polls that were done in mid to late April, assuming that somehow what's happening in North Carolina is based upon the progression of the coronavirus impact. Whether you say, well, Biden was up by basically 3 points, averaging those two, with a margin of error plus or minus 4.6. But again, you wouldn't put a whole lot of faith in those poll results because, first of all, they're old. Secondly, they're based upon, it says here, unlikely voters, but the big one that they did was based on registered voters. So we just don't really know. But I wanted to let you know about that because, well, we have a pretty good deal of confidence in the national polls when averaged together. When it comes to the state polls, it's much more unpredictable as to what really, whether we can really trust them or not. So I wanted to talk to you about some of the challenges that are facing pollsters and why the polls have these kinds of problems. So the first thing I wanted to talk about was the response rates. If you take a look at this chart, which was produced by Pew Research Center, you'll notice that the response rate in 1997 even was still only 36%. What this means is that when a pollster gets a representative sample of telephone numbers and tries to call all those numbers and get a hold of them, they only get a hold of 36%. That was 1997. Today, well, it was 2018, and it's no better now. 2018, they only get 6% of them. So here's your big sample, and you can only get a hold of 6% of the people. So you really ask yourself, how much difference is there between the 94% that we can't get a hold of, which is the vast majority, and the 6% who are willing to participate? Is there something about that 6% that makes them different from the 94%? And if the answer to that question is yes, and it certainly must be, who is willing these days to answer polls? Is it really a representative sample of all Americans when 94% of those in the sample won't? So that's a big problem. It's an incredibly important problem. What Pew Research has shown, and I'm not completely convinced about it, but is that if you do a telephone poll and you still only get a 6% response rate, that 6% still represents the 100%, more or less. But in any case, the fact that there is such a low response rate is an ongoing major problem with polls. The consequence is that many pollsters these days are moving to online polling. There are two reasons for it. One is that the low response rates mean that it's really expensive to call. Andy Smith, the UNH Survey Center, the survey center that I talked about, said that it used to take him, maybe he could get a couple of polls done in an hour. These days it takes him 2 hours to get one poll completed, one survey. And so the interviewer is dialing or, pressing the numbers and calling. Finally, they get a hold of somebody. And those are for short polls. So they're moving to online polling. Now, what Andy did is that he calculated for the elections that were the battleground states, and the contested and battleground states elections from 2006, 2016, what kind of polls were being conducted. Well, if you take a look at the green line, you'll see that that's the percentage of polls that conducted in those states that are live phone. And the reason we mention live phone is that's considered to be the gold standard. You get live phone, at least you've ensured that you try to make sure everybody has an equal chance of being selected. If you just do IVR, which is those automated phone calls, and you must know when you get those automated phone calls, they come on, they're automated. You have to answer the phone by answer the survey by punching in the data. That was very popular in 06, 08, and even into 2010 because they were so cheap. You just automate them, you call the phone, it's great. The problem was that the federal government has a law which forbids automated dialing on cell phones. You can't have automated dialing. Don't ask me why, it's just there, and it's for a lot of different reasons. So as a consequence, as the cell phone use began to increase, the automated phone line began to decrease because you just couldn't get hold of everybody. Today, over half the people, or half the adults in the United States have cell phone only use. So if you're going to exclude, 45% of the public, 45% of half the voters, you're not going to get a good poll. So they did for a while combine IVR with online, and that's really gone down too. What we see really happening is this blue line. The blue line, which is online, and now it's gone up to where in 2016, you had over half of the polls that were done in the contested areas done online. But how do you do them online? The problem is to get people online, you actually advertise. That's what the pollsters do. They advertise and say, do you want to join and be a part of our panel? And they are a part of it. So then people join, they're a part of the panel. And then on an infrequent basis, on a periodic basis, they will be asked to fill out polls, and it's all online. But you can imagine the problem of having online polls is that you can't be sure that the people who agreed to be a part of your panel are necessarily representative of the general public. And so every pollster who has online polling will have some way of weighting the data, manipulating the demographic characteristics to make that sample look like the national population or the state population, which they're doing. But it's not as good. And it's more, so we're talking about more and more problems with polls as people going online. The advantage from the pollster point of view is it's very cheap. Once you've got the people on your panel, then you can fill them out online and you can send out lots of surveys to people, and you just do it until you get the answer done. And of course now, the difficulty of doing telephone polling, of having a telephone call center with the coronavirus, means that those people who have an online panel can continue to do their polls, despite the fact that it might pose some serious problems from a validity viewpoint. The next major problem facing voters is identifying who's a likely voter. The problem is when we ask people online, we ask people on the phone or even online whether or not they're going to vote in the election, 85, 90% of the respondents say, yeah, I'm going to vote. The problem is we know that's not true. We know that the turnout is somewhere around 55% in national elections, 30, sometimes as low as 20% in states in midterms, a bit of midterms, maybe 35%. So what we need to do is try to find a way to separate out those people who say they will vote and those people who say they will vote and do vote from those who say they will but probably won't. What Gallup did, first started doing this in the 1950s after the 1948 debacle, when Gallup predicted that Dewey would be president and not Truman. They started developing a likely voter model. Their cutoff model is one that a lot of pollsters use. Not necessarily exactly the same, but basically it follows this method. You first ask a whole series of questions. Are you going to vote? How closely have you followed the election? Do you know where to vote? Have you voted before? And so on. And then for each question that gives the right answer or gives an answer that indicates they're an activist, they get 1 point. So at the end, everybody would be scored on the basis of 0 to 7 points. Nobody gets a 0 because if they did, they wouldn't be in the survey in the first place. But they get from 1 to 7. And what Gallup did then is basically they would take 6 and 7. If you scored 6 or you scored 7, they would take those people and say, that's the likely voters. And everybody who scored 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 would be just wiped out. The probability of model is different. They may score the same thing, 7 through 1, but they say, what's the probability that somebody with a 7 will vote? Maybe it's 80% or 90%. The probability that somebody with a 6 will vote, maybe that's 60%, and on down the line. Problem is, how do you figure out what the probabilities assigned to each one of those numbers? What we did, Gallup, when I was there, we did a follow-up survey after an election to find out what the probabilities were. Well, first of all, we couldn't get back to everybody. And when we did get back to them, we did go ahead and have a probability number for each one of the 7. But because we couldn't get back to over half the people, they said they were going to vote. So we went back after the election and said, well, did you vote? It just didn't work. And the probability model was used by the New York Times, CBS. When they were together, it really got a lot of problems. Okay, so the more common way that pollsters do it is they use 1, 2, or 3 screening questions. For example, we did at UNH, we said, what's the likelihood you would vote? And if you had one of the 2 top likelihoods, and you said you were extremely or very interested in voting in the election, then that would be the screening. If you score a 3 based upon that, you get 1 or 2, then we'd say, okay, those are voters. It's a cutoff model. It's a screening question. It's a cutoff. Only those people are likely to vote. Morning Consult, they ask people on their likelihood of voting. They say, what's your likelihood of voting on a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being high? Well, I want to show you what kids would. And what they said is that they will take anybody who has a score from 7 to 10. Yeah, and they cut off everybody else who has a score 1 to 6. Well, this verification study was done in Philadelphia in 1999, so it doesn't necessarily apply to what Morning Consult does. But I wanted to show you how it affects the likely voter model. For those people who scored a 10, that was 77% of the sample said, I'm absolutely 100% going to vote. 10. 84% of those voted. Of those who gave a 9, that was only 6% of the people, 71% voted. Of those who gave themselves an 8, now it was 6%, only half of those people voted. Of those people who said a 7, that was 3% of the population, only a third voted. And of those who said 1 through 6, that represented the other 7%, 39% voted. So you can see what the problem is. If you have a cutoff model that says I'm only going to take the top 10, you got a lot of people in your sample who are not going to vote, 16%. But if you take the top 7, 8, 9, and 10, you got a lot of people in there who say they're going to vote, not going to. So now, of course, I realize that this particular class, this validation scheme does not apply to what Morning Consult is doing in any given state. It's just that what happens is that every every pollster has to come up with some model, some best approximation. And that can be the cutoff model, probability model, the screening model, or they can weight it to make it look like the proper demographics, or they can use registered voter lists. In states which have good samples where the voter lists also have telephone numbers or addresses, which mostly they don't, then you can use the voter lists. The voter list, you can also find out whether a registered voter actually participated in the last election. You can say, well, okay, they participated in the last two, so it probably means they're going to vote this time. But you can see how the likely voter model is really the weak link to trying to figure out how your poll results should be reported. Registered voter is easy. Basically, you say, are you a registered voter or not? And of course, it's based on, in case in the states, if you got a registered voter list, you can find out if they're registered. Of course, that doesn't take into account states like New Hampshire, where you can register at the day of election. So there is no perfect way, but the registered voter list is an easier one. And most pollsters these days, that is leading up to the campaign, during the campaign, will use registered voter lists. And then they'll switch to likely voter as they move into the last month or so. Okay, and now the last big problem that's there, and that's what's called herding. That's kind of a general term. I didn't make up the term, but it's a general term for pollsters who really don't want their numbers evaluated against an actual election and therefore use various techniques to avoid doing it. The first one is they just refuse to conduct election polls. There are only two major pollsters who have come out and done that. In 2016, Gallup and Pew. They no longer conduct pre-election polls. Gallup had a real bad series in the three previous elections. Pew had, it wasn't so bad, but they had a really volatile tracking poll. And they just figured, hey, we're big names. We can go ahead and when we publish our public policy polls or anything else, people are going to pick them up. The press is going to pick them up because we're Gallup and we're Pew. And we don't have to go in toward the end and have our final election results compared against the actual election because it doesn't always look good. We don't need to do it, so they don't do it. Other pollsters conduct pre-election polls during the campaign, but not in the final days. For the two 2016 polls, Associated Press, USA Today, CNN, and Quinnipiac all did national polls, but then did not do any national polls in the final week beforehand so that their numbers, I say, I mean, I'm attributing their motivation, but I can see why they would not do it if they've been polling all along. They chose not to do it. And of course, their numbers then were never finally compared with the actual election. I showed you earlier that there were only a few pollsters in those three battleground states of Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin. Well, as you can see, these are all the organizations. Pennsylvania is probably the worst. CBS YouGov, NBC Wall Street Journal, CNN, Quinnipiac, and Bloomberg, and of course these as well. They all conducted polls during the campaign in Pennsylvania and did not do it in the last week. CBS YouGov did that same kind of behavior in Michigan and in Wisconsin. NBC Wall Street Journal did it in both Michigan and Pennsylvania. And you can see these others did it too. Those are all the ones that I got off Real Clear Politics. But what is really disappointing, and is a problem from a polling point of view, is that some of the most qualified, some of the best pollsters are avoiding the more difficult states, and instead they're willing to poll in there, but just not to put their reputation on the line. Here's another example of herding, and that's shading results to other polls, where the pollster says, "Oh, hey, I've got a result," and they can kind of manipulate a little bit. A likely voter, they can change the criteria for a likely voter and try to make it look more like what other polls are already showing. And the example, the most really bad example in 2019 was that Australia, all the polling companies, 16 polling companies in Australia predicted that Labour would win over a coalition group by 51 to 49, which is very small. If you have 51 to 49 as the average, there should be, there should be polls on either side. But all of them, none of the 16 polls published when the election was called on 10 April and the polling day on 18 May predicted a coalition win. And in the post-election analysis, this Nobel laureate, Professor Brian Schmidt, said the odds of those 16 polls coming with the same small spread of answers is greater than 100,000 to 1. In other words, the polls were manipulated. And that's what's called herding, where a pollster tries to make sure they're in the middle of it. A really good example also occurred in Australia is that right after the election, this guy, Chris Lonergan, no pollster would ever do this, but he was so honest, he came out and he admitted that his poll showed that the Labour was going to lose, but he did not release the results of it because no one wants to release a poll that is wildly out of step. We didn't want to be seen as having an inaccurate poll. And that's another kind of problem. And as 538 Nate Silver would say, when that happens, when you get a lot of pollsters either herding or not participating, it makes the overall predictions less accurate because you need a mean with a variance around the mean. And if everybody is just going into the same thing because they're afraid that their results that are a little bit off from the mean might be interpreted as an inaccurate pollster, then that means that the overall numbers are going to be distorted. So now we come down finally to what predictions are being made. I can answer questions. The basic thing I can say about the pollsters is this. I would have a lot more confidence in the national polls for the reasons that the experience. It's nothing really bright or insightful on my part. It's just that experience has with a lot of the major pollsters and using it all across the country, you can have more confidence. When you get to individual states, a lot of the major national pollsters don't know that state very well. And really you'd think, well, you don't need to know it, but the answer is you do. You need to know what, if there's a dominant city, for example, in New York City. When I did polling in New York State with Gallup, in polling in New York State, you couldn't just do a random sample of numbers across the state. You had to treat New York differently because New York had you could do the poll and you could do the likely voter, but New York turnout was always lower than what the polls would show. So not only did we have to do the polls, but we then had to weight New York down by a couple of percentage points in order to come out. And so every state is a little bit different. And that's why the national polls, people know those, but the state polls, if a pollster goes into that and they don't know the demographics, the politics, and so on, they can be wrong. So anyway, I just want to give you a overview of a lot of different predictions that have been made based upon what we've seen here. Some on polls, some not, and we'll take a look. This is from Nate Cohn, and it was only a couple weeks ago when he said, "Why Biden's polling lead versus Trump," which is we've seen in several, even in Florida and Arizona, and much more competitive in North Carolina, all three states that Hillary Clinton lost. But it doesn't necessarily, this is what he's saying, it isn't as solid as it looks. Two reasons. One, the battleground states versus the other states. In the battleground states, it tends to be much more competitive, which we know. I mean, that's because they're battleground states. Otherwise, why would they be battleground states? And they, of course, they're the ones. But it's also the registered voters versus likely voters. Typically what happens is that when you look at the results on registered voters, you get a more democratic picture than when you look at likely voters. That when you squeeze the electorate down into more likely voters, typically that drops out Democrats. And typically that's been because Democrats typically are lower socioeconomic scale, they represent, and the voters don't turn out as much. On the other hand, you've got Trump appealing to many of those voters with a populist appeal. So it's not quite clear. Some cases have shown these days, if you go back, you go back in the 90s or early 2000s, definitely. Likely voter model, the more you squeeze it, the more you're Republican. These days, I'm not quite so sure. In any case, according to Nate Cohn, his feeling is that that's still the case. And so it raises the possibility that Democrats could win the most votes and lose the White House for the third time. Rachel Lightgover, I think that's how you pronounce it, who's a professor, just said, Trump will lose in 2020. President is running hard on a strategy of riling up his base, but he'll rally the Democrats. And that argument really is based upon what happened in 2018, when there was actually a record surge in the number of people who turned out to vote. By record, I mean in modern times, the number of people, the percentage of people who turned out to vote in 2018 was higher than it had ever been. And of course, we know what happened there. The Democrats were very successful because mostly it was Democrats who were turned out to vote. Nate Cohn, same guy, Trump's electoral college could grow in 2020, rewarding polarizing campaign. The theory here is that even though you're going to get more Democrats to turn out, most of them are going to be in places like California and New York or Massachusetts, where they're going to win those states anyway. And so the increased turnout will be in blue states rather than in the purple states. Okay, that's his opinion, and remember, it's middle of July 2019. Then David Wasserman picks up by that same thing and says Trump could lose by 5 million votes and still win in 2020. Another one of those things. 5 million votes is somewhere around 4%. Hillary Clinton won, with 2% of the vote, with about 3 million votes. So it would be 3.5%. So you're almost saying in order for Joe Biden to win, he's going to have to win by better than 5 million votes, or by better than 4%. Okay. However, Charles Pierce from Esquire says, I don't make predictions, but it sure seems like Trump could get trounced in 2020. Just as likely as the notion he'll pull another inside straight. Okay. And then you get Charlie Cook. Charlie Cook does a Cook report. And he says, the fact that the country is not only narrowly divided but hyper-partisan means that nobody is going to win big. Keep that in mind. Small things can make big differences. Seeing what you want is so important not to engage in confirmation bias. And finally, the last one prediction is it just came from Frank Brody after this whole thing with Lysol and with bleach. And his, of course, prediction is not based upon polls, but is based upon kind of an outrage. The notion that he is bound for 4 more years is pure superstition. Most of us, however, want to take a look at the numbers and see what they mean. So that's it. I do have other numbers that I can show if anybody asks for them, but I think I've agreed that I should take answers now for anybody who might like to do that. And I will remove this from the, okay. And now I can see people.